This year, the county of Mecklenburg, North Carolina is celebrating the 250th anniversary of their Declaration of Independence, where they declared themselves free of the mother country over 1 year before the other 13 colonies declared independence on July 4th. But the big question is it real or is it a fraud? In this video, we're going to look at the history behind it and present the evidence on both sides. So if we go back 250 years ago, we were not the state of North Carolina. It was the colony of North Carolina, because there were not any states at that point in time. It was all the 13 colonies of England. But tensions had been building between England and her American colonies for quite some time, for years. And the famous phrase that people know of today, that boiled down into one phrase, is no taxation without representation. And that was certainly a significant element of the issues that the colonies had with the king, King George III at that time. The root question is a question of authority and jurisdiction. Does the English Parliament have jurisdiction over the colonies, over the colony of North Carolina, or are they governed by their own parliaments under the king? And these issues were worked through for years. It's not something that sprang up in 1776. I mean, we're talking about an event in 1775, which is over a year before the Declaration of Independence. And that's just a little 1 year is just a little part of the time that they spent laboring through these issues, trying to address them in a peaceful way before the war breaks out. But one thing that they're doing is they're realizing the direction that things are going is the Patriots organize what are called committees of safety throughout the colonies. Because one thing that the leaders are wanting to do is to make sure that it's not just a Massachusetts issue. Because a lot of these issues were in Massachusetts. That's where the king sent troops. That's the Boston Massacre, obviously, is Massachusetts. But they want all the colonies to realize that it's an issue of authority, and that even if they're not the ones that are enduring the things that Boston's enduring, that the principle of the matter means that they're connected, because they have the same relationship to England as Massachusetts does. And so that happens in all the colonies, in North Carolina as well. They're also organizing a boycott of the taxed British goods that they're saying are illegally taxed. And they also are reorganizing the militia, because that was an important thing. It was already established back from the very beginning to defend against Indian attacks. They're making sure that the militia is organized, because that's going to be their first military force if they have to fight the king and the redcoats. There's also even a what's now countrywide organization in 1774. They call a joint Congress of Representatives from the colonies, and it's called the Continental Congress. And so that meets, up until it kind of transitions into the United States Congress. And North Carolina, of course, has its place in all of this. Virginia was the largest colony at that time, but North Carolina was not too far behind. A lot of the colonies had around 200,000 residents, and that's right where North Carolina was. And in 1775, these issues that have been building for years are coming to a head. On April 8th, the royal governor of North Carolina dissolved the legislature. And the reason he did this was that it was too pro-patriot. But the legislature continued to meet without his blessing, and now this tension's building. Now you have this legislature that the patriots are recognizing, the majority of the people are recognizing, but the governor is saying is illegal. And on April 19th, the war begins at the Battle of Lexington and Concord, where the British troops leave Boston, Massachusetts, to go try to capture patriot leaders and capture militia supplies. Fighting breaks out at Lexington in what's called the shot heard around the world. There the patriots were scattered, but the word goes out and the militia are gathering, and they hold the British back at Concord, and as the British march back to Boston, they're harassed all along the way, and they have a lot of casualties. A lot of British soldiers perish there. And now the war has begun, because it has been clear that the militia is not going to allow the British to disarm them. Instead, they will fight back. And word spreads quickly through the colonies. Riders are sent out telling what has happened to Massachusetts. Now let's turn our focus to Mecklenburg County. And at that time, Charlotte was a very small town. The population of North Carolina was a lot more concentrated on the coast. Raleigh didn't even exist at this time. Charlotte was already established as a town, and they were inspired by what happened in Boston. They had been having discussions at a lecture hall called the Queen's Hall, and that's called the Faneuil Hall of North Carolina, because Faneuil Hall is a famous hall in Boston where they had all these meetings organizing the movements for independence, and Queen's Hall is seen as the same type of place in North Carolina. And some of the people involved in these meetings, patriot meetings, a lot of them were Presbyterian ministers. Reportedly, George III called the whole American Revolution a Presbyterian Parsons revolt. Now, that's not strictly true, because there were a lot of, or more denominations than that involved, but it had an element of truth, particularly in Mecklenburg County, where a lot of the leaders were Presbyterians. And this is, of course, where the Mecklenburg Declaration is supposed to have been written. So what I've said so far, no one's going to argue with that. This next section is a bit controversial. So as the story goes, when they get this word of the Battle of Lexington and Concord, word is sent to them, and they are pretty outraged at this. And so they send instructions to all the militia companies as kind of representatives of the people, that they're each to send 2 delegates to a convention of Mecklenburg County. And these meet on May 19th, 1775. And it's also attended by people from the surrounding area, up to even half the men in the county, some people would remember. And they debate what should they do. They work through the night. As one man later said, neither sleepy, hungry, or fatigued. And unanimously, they pass at 2 a.m. on May 20th, what's called the Mecklenburg Declaration of Independence. And it has a few resolutions, but I'll read 2 of the most important. Resolved that we, the citizens of Mecklenburg County, do hereby dissolve the political bands which have connected us to the mother country, and hereby absolve ourselves from all allegiance to the British Crown, and abjure all political connection, contract, or association with that nation, who have wantonly trampled on our rights and liberties, and inhumanly shed the innocent blood of American patriots at Lexington. And the next one, resolved that we do hereby declare ourselves a free and independent people. We are and of right ought to be a sovereign and self-governing association, under the control of no power other than that of our God and the general government of Congress, to the maintenance of which independence we solemnly pledge to each other our mutual cooperation, our lives, our fortunes, and our most sacred honor. And the rest of the resolutions then reaffirmed all the existing laws, because they're saying we're independent, but we're not going to get rid of all the laws. Murder is not going to be legal. We're going to keep enforcing the laws, keep the militia companies being legal institutions. And then there is a list that has been preserved of 33 signers. And we're not going to get into the controversy of whether those were original list or prepared later. We're just going to skip right over that. There were 33 people that supposedly signed it. So then they have these resolves, and they are then proclaimed from the courthouse door to the surrounding people, and the inhabitants receive them with joy. Soon after, they deputize a man, Captain James Jack of Charlotte, a militia captain, and they send him to Philadelphia to ride up to Pennsylvania bearing a copy of the resolves to deliver them to North Carolina's representatives in the Continental Congress. And on the way, he read the Declaration in at least one open court session. And so he's kind of seen as the Paul Revere of North Carolina, spreading the word of this Declaration of Independence through the colonies. Now, when the delegates to the Continental Congress get this Declaration of Independence, they say, okay, well, I like your zeal, but what you're doing is premature. We haven't worked through all the issues we need to with the king. And so they kind of put a damper on what Mecklenburg County was doing. So that's the Mecklenburg Declaration. Let's and the controversial section. And we'll go back to what transpired as the revolution spread to North Carolina. So soon after May 1775, North Carolina did become truly independent. The royal governor fled to a British warship off the coast, and North Carolina would end up being the scene of several important battles. Moores Creek Bridge, Guilford Courthouse, Kings Mountain is just south of the border. And there was also a lot of internal fighting because, we heard that the legislature was majority patriot. There were still a lot of loyalists, and some of them were willing to fight for the king. And so there was, a lot of kind of even irregular guerrilla-type warfare that took place in the state. On July 4th, 1776, we have the famous Declaration of Independence issued, written primarily by Thomas Jefferson. And this, as we note, is over a year after the war has begun at Lexington and Concord, and it's over a year after the Mecklenburg Declaration. And that was, of course, very intentional, because the sober-headed leaders of the Patriot cause wanted to take their time. They did not want to rush into things. They did not want to be seen or to be rebels in a bad way. And they wanted to exhaust every avenue of appeal for the king and parliament to redress their grievances. So they have this kind presumption or fiction that the king did not agree with parliament and that the parliament was going against the king. And so even as the king is choosing to go to war with them, they're saying, if the king only was controlling his representatives, we would be, we'd be on the same page and he would respect our rights. But eventually this became obviously untrue, and then you get the Declaration of Independence where they're reasoning, here's the reason why it's right for us to be free and independent. This was quite the fame for Mecklenburg County, and it's been made quite a lot of over the years. Because it was 15 months before the Declaration of Independence that this Mecklenburg Declaration came out. And it even used, I don't know if you caught it, some of the same phrases from the Declaration of Independence. So Jefferson must have been reading over their shoulder, perhaps. There's a few monuments. There's a monument to the signers in 1898, and that monument is still in downtown Charlotte. Another monument was put up just recently in 2010. It's of Captain Jack on horseback bearing that declaration north to the Continental Congress. And so Mech Deck Day, as it's called, at one point that was an official state holiday. Today it's not official anymore. Some people certainly celebrate it. 4 presidents from between Taft and Ford participated in celebrations in Mecklenburg, in Charlotte, to commemorate this event. So 50 years ago, kind of an interesting rabbit trail, a Charlotte marketeer planned a recreated ride to, commemorate and gin up enthusiasm probably for Charlotte. And so he had people audition for the role of Captain Jack. He found this bull rider, cowboy guy, and got him period garb and had him take this, weeks-long ride up to Philadelphia. Well, on the way, he actually was arrested because someone called the police and said he's, mistreating his horse. He's riding him too many miles a day. So he's arrested, but he ends up getting cleared and finished the ride. But it comes out later that it was actually that promoter who organized it all who called the police. He's saying, I'm not getting enough publicity for this event. Let's get in the newspaper headlines. Let's call the police on my own guy. And the rider was not too happy to hear about that, but, he got out. It was all fine. He didn't go to prison. That's the Mecklenburg Declaration, which, seems like a neat and tidy story. But let's go back to how we know things are real. Because just because someone says this happened in history doesn't mean it actually did. And just because a lot of people say it happened doesn't mean it actually did. So it is said that one copy of the Declaration survived until it was burnt in the house of a man named John McNitt Alexander in the year 1800. So 25 years after it was written, the last copy burns. And some of this is controversial depending on which defender you read, but I'm going to try to simplify the story because there's I read a few long books, people debating this back and forth, but I'm going to try to cut to the chase to the important points because there are stories about people forging documents, people covering up documents. We're going to try to cut to the chase and make this to the simple issue, is it real or not? So we have John McNitt Alexander, who he had the copy. He, I believe, was one of the signers of the Declaration, as the story goes. So he then rewrites it from memory, but then he dies. And his son, Joseph Alexander, publicizes this account in papers after his death. A copy is also published a few years later in a History of North Carolina, which, and the man that published this was an eminent North Carolinian who knew a lot of the original figures and interviewed various people for this book he had produced. And some say that this was a corrected version. Others say that he had a different original version that does not exist anymore, because his version is different than the one that was rewritten from memory. Well, and then this story, when it comes out, is pretty popular, because a lot of people, as some of these big events are going on, you don't always know always the flow of history until you look at it in reverse. Kind of the hindsight is 20/20 type idea. So a lot of North Carolinians were excited to hear about this, and word spread across the country. The independence had been declared a lot earlier than a lot of people had heard of. But the first blow against it comes from quite a notable source. In 1819, former President John Adams, at this time a very old man, he comes across it, and he sends it to his friend, former President Thomas Jefferson, and he calls it one of the greatest curiosities and one of the deepest mysteries that he had ever seen. Because he had a hard time believing that he had not heard of it back in 1775 when it originally came out. And he sent it to Thomas Jefferson, and he tells him, I'm sure you've seen this, because parts of it are so similar to what you wrote. Phrases here and there. So Thomas Jefferson, he replies, you seem to think it genuine. I believe it's spurious. Because he hadn't heard of it either. And he did not believe that if it had been printed, he would not have heard about it back in 1775. That it should have escaped general notice during the Revolution, because at that moment it was or would have been such a revolutionary step. And that had not been discussed by any subsequent historians for decades until it later came to light. He said that Patrick Henry's resolutions, and this isn't his Give Me Liberty speech, this is some other resolves that he had put together. He said they were far short of independence, but flew like lightning through every paper and kindled both sides of the Atlantic. And so if this declaration were genuine, will not every advocate of independence have rung the glories of Mecklenburg County and North Carolina in the ears of the doubting Dickinson and others who hung so heavily on us? So he concludes by saying that he can't prove that it was a fake, but he would need a lot of proof to believe it was genuine. And he convinced Adams, for one, that it was a fake. But not everyone, and not the North Carolina legislature. They organize a committee in 1830, which investigates it, tries to find all the original documents they can, and they ended up judging it authentic. But there's another twist to the story. It's not over yet. Because in 1838, another set of resolves were rediscovered. Several copies, and these ones are definitely genuine. At least, it's hard to find people who say they're not genuine. There's enough controversy that you can find someone saying almost everything. But these are, these I think you can rely on as genuine, because they have found them printed in several period papers of the time. And there weren't a lot of those. North Carolina only had 2 newspapers, and a lot of those you can only find a little bit here and there. So that's one thing, is the fact that you didn't find the Mecklenburg Declaration in newspapers from the time didn't necessarily mean that it didn't exist, because even 25 years later didn't mean that they hadn't lost all the copies even by that point. Anyway, back to the Mecklenburg resolves. So these were dated May 31st. And the preamble said this: whereas by an address presented to His Majesty by both houses of Parliament in February last, the American colonies are declared to be in an actual state of rebellion, we conceive that all laws and commissions confirmed by or derived from the authority of the King or Parliament are annulled and vacated, and the former civil constitution of these colonies, for the present, wholly suspended. To provide in some degree for the exigencies of the county in the present alarming period, we deem it proper and necessary to pass the following resolves. And then it continues with a bunch of different resolves, laying out practical matters of government, of defense, collection of taxes, selection of magistrates independent from the crown, basically ensuring that the government would continue. Because what they're saying is, Parliament has declared us in rebellion, and we want to keep having a government, and now we can't say our government is coming from the king anymore, the king and Parliament, so now we have to, organize it as derived from the people themselves. And it actually made it a crime to accept a commission from the crown. And then it ends with a caveat that these resolves are only valid until the legislative body of Great Britain resign its unjust and arbitrary pretensions with respect to America. Like I said, these aren't disputed. And there are some interesting stuff about these. Some would say that this is them kind of laying out the details of what they declared on May 20th. On May 20th, they declare independence, and here they work out the details. Others would say, well, this virtually is a declaration of independence, and it doesn't say you declared independence before. And the only difference between it not being a declaration of independence is they're saying Parliament has thrown us out. It's declared we're in rebellion. So we are independent. We're not rebelling and saying we're independent. We just are. So these resolves apparently were sent also by Captain Jack to Philadelphia. So the debate over the Mecklenburg Declaration is a long one. And what I want to do is go through a few of the arguments for it and a few against it. So there's two positions. One is that the declaration is genuine, that it's real. The second one is that the declaration is not real, and that what happened was people misremembered, or they remembered that they had done something like declaring independence. And then years later, someone recreates it, and it ends up getting misstated, and it's basically he's remembering the resolves and calling them a declaration of independence. So those are the two positions. So let's go first through some of the arguments for it being real. Once they come out and publish this text in the early 1800s, before the resolves are discovered, people go around and interview a lot of these elderly men who were involved, whose names even were on the list of signers. And they get, I think about a dozen of them, a little more than a dozen, and all these people corroborate the story. They say it's true. We remember this. And they give accounts of what happened, including Captain Jack, who says, I remember carrying these to Philadelphia. Now, it's been a long time. And so, like Captain Jack, for example, says, I remember we declared independence in May or June, and I rode up to Philadelphia. So, he is saying what I read is the real thing. And that's important. And, you have these eminent people who are eyewitnesses who are saying it happened. There's also a few references earlier. There's like a German Moravian history. Before this came out, they later went back and found that they had said the county of Mecklenburg in North Carolina declared itself free and independent of England. And there is a schoolboy who had published in a newspaper a declaration, or a mention of the declaration, before it had been publicly known. And he actually was the grandson of John Alexander, which arguably weakens what he had to say considerably, since he is the guy from whose papers the declaration was rediscovered. So those are the arguments for it. That we have the text of it, all the witnesses said it happened, so it happened. So let's move to the ones against it. So like I mentioned, the witnesses were imprecise on many details, and almost everything they said could have applied to the Mecklenburg resolves from May 31st, not May 20th. And those are indisputable because they're mentioned numerous times in British correspondence when the Mecklenburg Declaration does not appear. And like I said, it's known that the record isn't complete, but like Jefferson said, it's hard to believe that there wouldn't have, some note of it wouldn't have been mentioned in some record, in some letter, in something. I mean, some of it's ambiguous, but you would think if they're using the words declare independence, somebody would have wrote that down. Nearly all the patriots up to this point up to actually July 1776, were careful to oppose Parliament, not the king. Even Mecklenburg courts mentioned His Majesty in some of the things they were doing. Even some of the signers on the list of signers of the Mecklenburg Declaration signed the document later in 1775 saying they were loyal to the king and proclaimed that they were not trying to seek independence. If there was a Declaration of Independence, they would have been contradicting what they had said, which could be true. They could have contradicted it. You know, that one, people contradict themselves at times, as we may have noticed talking to people. So there's also the issue of those phrases that are the same in the Declaration of Independence and the Mecklenburg Declaration, where, like, dissolve the political bands which have connected, or our lives, our fortunes, and our most sacred honor. Those are phrases that in the 1800s were well known because the Declaration had become a very famous document. And Jefferson didn't coin those phrases that no one had ever said before, but it would seem more reasonable that they almost would have had to plagiarize the Mecklenburg Declaration. So those are the two sides. I think that it never happened. So I think that the resolves are the genuine copy, and that what happened is John Alexander, he had his papers burned, his house burned down, he lost his papers, and so he tried to recreate it from memory. And, you know, I've signed documents even like a year ago, and if someone showed me a fake copy of it, I could be easily convinced that I signed it. And so I can, you know, I'm not saying he was out here trying to lie, but if he's trying to recreate it, it's easy to kind of slip in some phrases from the 1776 Declaration of Independence. That's real easy to do, accidentally. It's real easy to spice it up a little bit. And when in the resolves you didn't declare independence, remembering it 25 years later, to just make it a little, say, we use that phrase. You know, just poor memory. So, you know, there's his notes are there, and then later you have a cleaned up version that comes out, and, you know, I can believe that his son Joseph cleaned it up, made it a bit smoother. And so you have all these witnesses when they're given the one copy, because they hadn't rediscovered the resolves yet. They're given the one copy and said, "Did you sign this?" They're like, "Here it is in black and white printed text. It's close enough to what I remember. I believe it." You know, and the date shift, I couldn't give you the dates for many things that happened in my life within 2 weeks. You know, birthdays, I remember my own birthday, you know. My kid's birthday, you know. But there's not a lot of things you can remember the date for. So it's easy for me to believe that the date just got shifted a little bit. And they asked the witnesses, and they're like, "Sure, I can believe that." So, you know, without really much fraud, or perhaps even any fraud, you can have it come out. And the fact that then later the resolves come out, you know, it seems to answer a lot of the questions about it, but, you know, at that point, people were pretty dug in their positions. North Carolina has one of the oldest flags designs of any of the states, and one of the only elements that's been unchanged since the Civil War, when a similar design was introduced as North Carolina's first official flag, was a date on the flag, and that's May 20, 1775. And that points back to the Mecklenburg Declaration. You know, I'm saying we need to change the flag. You know, we can compromise. We can put May 1775, but, you know, gotta change the flag. That's my position. So, you know, accuracy is important, even if it's a few days different. And this, of course, is not to dishonor the people involved, because the Mecklenburg resolves of May 31st went nearly as far. They're saying Parliament has rejected us, therefore we are independent. That's what they're saying. And so the fact that they didn't use quite as inflammatory language as this spurious declaration, it actually, I would say, was more honorable, that they're still being patient, that they're not trying to be rebellious, they're trying to go through the process of redressing their grievances as carefully as possible. You know, our license plates, some of our license plates say First and Freedom. We can still keep that. May 31st, no one else did it before May 31st. So, you know, that's not in danger at all. Anyway, let me wrap this up with kind of a few kind of broader thoughts. It can be hard to know what happened in the past, especially with, you know, really ancient history. Some of that stuff, you only have one person writing what happened. He may not have even been an eyewitness. You know, the 18th century, you have a lot more records, and we can see that a lot of this stuff is difficult to see if it's real or not. Often it's kind of a question of probabilities rather than 100% provable fact. And when we're thinking about these things, we need to not spice up the historical truth. History is the study of what happened, not what we wish had happened, not what makes a better story, not what we can convince ourselves of happening. And we shouldn't, in this, as in so many areas, we shouldn't let pride cloud our judgment. Because I'm sure that some people really clung to this Mecklenburg Declaration because, I mean, it's, you know, what North Carolina, which in some ways, you know, politically was kind of a backwater, didn't have any great leaders, suddenly it gets raised to the forefront, and if evidence comes out to challenge that, you know, people who love their state or proud of their state don't want to really consider another side of it. One final thing. People talk a lot about revisionist history, people going back and changing the history. So this is a situation, there's actually a lot of ones like this, because history is always where you have double revisionist history. Who is revisionist history anymore? You know, the first revision said that Thomas Jefferson didn't write the Declaration of Independence. The first one was from Mecklenburg. And then the new revisionist history comes along and says, well, that's not real, it was just the Mecklenburg Resolves. And that's one thing is, you know, the concept of revisionist history is very real. What matters is the truth, not whether someone is revising something or not. A lot of times people revise things to fit their political opinions and not because the narrative out there was false. But sometimes it needs to be revised because what out there is false. And so, you know, we have to have our allegiance to the truth and not to the past, not to the current consensus, but to what matters and what actually happened.
Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe and share it with your friends. You can also visit www.discerninghistory.com for more videos and other resources.